A doctor accidentally injects sperm intended for artificial insemination into a college student's uterus, leading to an unexpected pregnancy for the Virgin Sophia. Leo, the CEO of a major beer company and the wealthiest, most sought-after man in the area, had battled cancer at the height of his career, which left him infertile. Sophia walked into the small, quiet hospital with a sense of calm, her mind drifting away from the stress of her college life. She had spent the last few weeks buried in books, trying to keep up with her coursework. But today was different. Today she was here for something routine, a simple checkup. Her best friend, Nina, had insisted she go, saying that it was better to be safe than sorry. Sophia agreed, but deep down she felt no reason to worry. After all, she was a healthy 19-year-old college student, with no history of medical issues. She sat in the waiting room, flicking through a magazine and waiting for her name to be called. The hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the low hum of voices mixed with the occasional beep of equipment. Sophia's mind wandered to other things, to the semester ahead, to the presentation she was supposed to deliver in class next week. Then the nurse called her name. Sophia stood up, brushing her loose braids behind her ear. She followed the nurse down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the sterile silence. She was led into a small room and asked to change into a hospital gown, a simple request she had done countless times before. While Sophia changed, the nurse seemed to be in a rush, glancing at the computer screen in the corner of the room. Sophia didn't think much of it at the time. The nurse wasn't the most attentive. She was always distracted whenever she was assisting with her routine checkups. When Sophia finished and sat on the examination bed, the doctor entered the room. He smiled politely, but his eyes looked tired. "Good afternoon, Miss Sophia," the doctor greeted her. "We're just going to do a quick checkup today as usual. Nothing to worry about." Sophia smiled back, trying to relax. The doctor went through the usual motions, listening to her heartbeat, checking her blood pressure, and asking a few questions about her general health. But then he paused. He looked down at the computer screen in front of him and seemed puzzled for a moment. "There seems to be a mix-up with your file," the doctor said, tapping the keyboard. "It's a little unusual, but it looks like you've been marked as a candidate for a fertility procedure. Are you sure there's been no mistake?" Sophia's heart skipped a beat. Fertility procedure. That didn't make any sense. She had never been pregnant, and the last thing she needed was fertility treatment. "Wait, what do you mean?" "I'm just here for a checkup," Sophia said, trying to sound calm. The doctor nodded, but his face was still creased with confusion. "I'll have to check with the staff. It might be a mix-up with another patient. You don't need to worry about anything right now. Let's just finish your routine examination, and I'll take care of the rest." Meanwhile, at a private clinic across town, Leo sat alone in a stark white office, staring at the paperwork in front of him. He was a man who had achieved everything he had ever wanted. A successful CEO of a thriving wine company, a millionaire with everything at his fingertips, but something was missing, something he could never have. It had been a few years since Leo had been diagnosed with cancer, and the treatment had left him infertile. He had always dreamt of becoming a father, of raising a child with the love of his life, Annabelle. But she had made it clear that she didn't want children. Annabelle was beautiful, a famous supermodel whose career came first. She wasn't interested in motherhood. Leo had tried to make it work, but their relationship was strained. She wasn't the woman he thought she was, and their marriage was barely holding together. Still, he held on to the hope that he might one day be a father, even if it meant relying on a surrogate mother. The clinic had been his decision. It was a way to ensure that he could still have a child, even though he couldn't father one himself. He had left a sperm sample with the clinic, and for the past few months, they had been searching for a surrogate. Leo had no idea that the clinic had mixed up his file with someone else's, and that his sperm would soon be injected into a young woman who had no idea about the life that was about to grow inside her. Back at the hospital, Sophia sat nervously in the waiting room as time passed. She could hear hushed conversations between the hospital staff outside the door. The doctor came back in, holding a clipboard with a serious look on his face. Miss Sophia, he began, I'm afraid there's been a mistake. Your file was swapped with another patient's. It looks like you've been given a procedure that wasn't intended for you the last time you came in for your checkup. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. What do you mean? What procedure? The doctor hesitated. It seems that you were mistakenly given a fertility treatment that was meant for someone else. You're pregnant. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. Pregnant, she whispered, her hands trembling. But I've never been with anyone. I'm a virgin. The doctor blinked, clearly taken aback by her response. This doesn't make sense. We will need to run some tests, but it seems your body has already accepted the pregnancy. Hey, sorry. This is a very unusual situation. Meanwhile, Leo's life was about to take a turn he hadn't expected either. The clinic had just informed him that the surrogate carrying his child wasn't carrying his child at all. Mr. Leo, the nurse on the other end of the line, said, "There's been an issue. The surrogate you chose isn't pregnant with your sperm. There's been a mix-up with the files." Leo's heart sank. The world seemed to tilt around him. What did this mean? His dream of becoming a father was slipping further away. Sophia's world felt like it was spinning out of control. She sat in a sterile room at the hospital, her hands clutching the edge of the bed as if that small, simple action could ground her. A million thoughts raced through her mind, each one more confusing and terrifying than the last. She was pregnant. How could that be possible? She had never been with a man, never even had a boyfriend, and yet here she was, being told she was carrying a child. The doctor, still looking flustered, stood at the foot of the bed, his face a mixture of apology and disbelief. "I know this is a lot to process, Miss Sophia, but we need to run some further tests to confirm everything. We have a very unusual situation on our hands." "Unusual?" Sophia's voice cracked as she stared at him. "I don't even understand what's going on. You're telling me that I'm pregnant, but I've never. How could this happen?" The doctor shifted uncomfortably, his gaze avoiding hers. "As I mentioned earlier, there's been a mix-up with your file. It looks like the procedure you underwent was intended for someone else. You received fertility treatment meant for a surrogate mother, and it seems your body has accepted the pregnancy." Sophia could barely breathe as the words hit her. She didn't even know how to respond. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of this new reality she had been thrust into. Was this some kind of sick joke? How could the hospital make such a mistake? She had come in for a simple checkup and was now being told she was pregnant, a pregnancy that wasn't even supposed to happen. Who's the father?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The doctor hesitated. "We will let you know soon." Sophia nodded numbly, trying to process the weight of the words, but nothing made sense. The doctor left, leaving her alone in the room. Her mind was clouded with confusion. Back at the clinic, Leo was pacing in his office, unable to believe what he had just heard. The nurse's words echoed in his head like a distant thunderclap. "Mr. Leo, I'm so sorry. There's been a mix-up. The surrogate you were assigned. She's not carrying your child." Leo felt the air leave his lungs. His legs went weak, and he stumbled back into his chair. "What do you mean? How can this be? I was told everything was in order. We double-checked the records. There's been a mistake in the file. You were listed as the father of a different surrogate, and it looks like the procedure was administered to someone else entirely." A chill ran through Leo's body. He gripped the arms of the chair, trying to steady himself. The dream of becoming a father had seemed so close. He had held on to the hope that one day he would have a child to call his own. Now that hope felt like it was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't even know who to blame. "Are you telling me that the woman carrying my child isn't even pregnant?" Leo's voice was sharp, rising with frustration. "Not exactly," the nurse replied. "The surrogate is not carrying your sperm, but she is pregnant. We're trying to figure out where the mistake happened. It's complicated, Mr. Leo." Leo leaned forward, his mind spinning. A part of him felt betrayed, betrayed by the clinic, by his own body, by everything. He had placed his trust in this process, and now it was all falling apart. "Keep me updated," he said coldly before hanging up the phone. He needed to think, to figure out what had happened and, more importantly, how to fix it. But nothing made sense. This wasn't just a mix-up, it was a nightmare. Meanwhile, Sophia sat in a small cafe near her campus, the steam rising from her cup of coffee doing little to warm the chill in her chest. She had left the hospital earlier that day in a daze, barely able to comprehend the news she had been given. She had tried to reach her family, but the words seemed impossible to form. How could she explain something so unbelievable? No one would believe her. They would think she was lying or hiding something. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from her best friend, Nina. "Girl, what happened at the doctor's office? You okay?" Sophia stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. How could she explain that she was carrying a child? A child that wasn't supposed to be there. A child that didn't even belong to her. She typed and erased several responses before finally putting her phone down. It was easier not to talk about it. It was easier to pretend nothing had happened. But the truth was, something had happened. Sophia could feel it deep down in her bones. Her life had just taken a sharp turn, and she didn't know where it was going. The next few days were a blur. Sophia was called back to the hospital for more tests and scans, each one confirming what she feared. She was pregnant, and the baby inside her was growing. But still the question remained. Who was the father? Sophia's confusion deepened when the hospital contacted her about a man named Leo, a CEO of a large company. His sperm, it turned out, had been mistakenly used in the procedure that led to her pregnancy. The hospital had tried to reach him, but no one had been able to get in touch. Sophia sat on the edge of her bed that night, staring at the message the hospital had sent her. She didn't know how to feel. How could she be carrying a child that wasn't hers? How could this be real? Meanwhile, Leo had started his own investigation, trying to piece together the mystery of the mix-up. He wasn't sure how, but he knew that his sperm had been used for someone else's fertility treatment. He was desperate to understand how it happened, and more than anything, he was desperate to find out who the woman was who was carrying his child. Soon Sophia was called back to the hospital to meet the father of the child. She sat quietly in the corner of the hospital's waiting room, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of emotions. The door to the waiting room swung open, and a nurse emerged, calling her name. Sophia stood up quickly, smoothing her dress, though it didn't help to calm her nerves. This was it, the moment when everything would change. She was about to meet the man whose sperm had been mistakenly used to make her pregnant. When she entered the examination room, her heart raced as the nurse closed the door behind her. There was a man standing by the window, tall and broad-shouldered. His face was set in a hard expression, but his eyes seemed weary, almost lost. He was Leo, the CEO she had heard about, the man whose life had been intertwined with hers by a mistake neither of them could understand. "Miss Sophia." Leo's voice was deep, tinged with exhaustion. He turned to face her, his gaze intense yet somehow distant. "Yes," Sophia answered, feeling a wave of uncertainty wash over her. Leo stepped forward, extending a hand, but Sophia hesitated before shaking it. She didn't know what to say or how to feel about the man in front of her. He was a stranger, but his presence seemed to demand attention. He was, after all, the father of her child, though the idea of it still felt unreal. "I'm Leo," he began. "I know this is overwhelming, but we need to sort things out." His voice softened, and he looked at her with an expression that was almost apologetic. "I never intended for this to happen." Sophia swallowed hard, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. "I don't know what's going on. I didn't ask for this, Mr. Leo. I'm just a student. I don't have the life of someone like you." Leo's eyes flickered with something between guilt and frustration. "I know, and I'm sorry you're in this situation. I don't know how this happened, but I promise you I'll help figure it out." For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was strange. standing in the same room with the man whose life had somehow collided with hers. Leo wasn't what she had imagined. His appearance didn't match the aloof, uncaring businessman she had expected. Instead, there was an underlying sadness in his eyes, a deep ache that seemed to mirror her own confusion and fear. "I don't understand why I'm pregnant," Sophia finally said, her voice trembling. "I've never even been with anyone. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. My family will never accept this." Leo's gaze softened. "I'm not here to make things harder for you, Sophia. I know this is crazy. But I want you to know that you're not alone in this." I don't know what to say," Sophia whispered, her chest tight. "This isn't what I imagined for myself." "I understand," Leo said quietly. "I didn't imagine this either. This situation wasn't supposed to happen. I thought I was going to have a child through a surrogate. But now it's all mixed up." Sophia looked up at him, a question bubbling in her mind. "A surrogate? You wanted a child?" Leo nodded. "I've been trying for years after my illness. I had cancer and the treatment left me infertile. I wanted to be a father. I wanted to raise a child with my wife. But she didn't want that. She doesn't want children, and she doesn't want to be a mother." Sophia blinked, processing his words. His voice had an edge to it, one that betrayed his disappointment and the heartache of a man who had never been able to reach the dream he so desperately longed for. "That must be hard," she said softly. Leo's lips tightened into a thin line, and for a moment, it seemed as though he was wrestling with emotions he didn't want to face. "It is. It's been incredibly hard. I didn't expect any of this," Sophia said quietly, her voice trembling. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. I don't have a plan for this." Leo took a deep breath. "Neither do I. But we'll figure it out together. We can help each other." Sophia was overwhelmed, but a small part of her felt comforted. Leo wasn't a stranger anymore. He was someone who understood the pain of loss, the desire for something more, the sense of helplessness that gnawed at them both. As they sat down to talk more about their next steps, Leo opened up about his wife, Annabelle. "She doesn't want a child. She never did. I thought I could convince her. I thought that maybe she would change her mind, but it's clear she won't. And now I'm stuck." "I'm sorry," she said softly. "It's hard when someone you love doesn't want the same things." Leo nodded, his gaze distant. "I don't know what to do anymore. But I do know one thing. I don't want to walk away from this. From you." They sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared experiences hanging in the air. Neither of them knew where this conversation would lead, but for the first time in days, Sophia felt a small flicker of hope. She didn't know how things would turn out, but she knew she wasn't alone in this anymore. The weeks that followed were a blur of confusion and emotions for both Sophia and Leo. They continued to meet, speaking more about their lives, their pain, and the unexpected circumstances that had brought them together. It was a strange, fragile connection, but something about their shared vulnerability made them feel understood, even in the chaos of it all. Sophia felt less alone with every conversation, and Leo, despite his ever-present bitterness about his marriage, found solace in their talks. It wasn't just that Annabelle didn't want kids. It was much darker than that. Leo hadn't known the full extent of Annabelle's indifference. He had suspected things were wrong in their marriage, but he never imagined the truth would be so painful. One day, as Leo was walking through the halls of his company, a text message from his lawyer flashed across his phone. The message was simple, but it carried a weight that made Leo stop in his tracks. "Leo, we need to talk. Urgent. Call me when you can." His heart sank. He knew something wasn't right. He called his lawyer immediately, his mind racing with possibilities. "Mr. Leo, I've come across some troubling information." His lawyer's voice was low, hesitant. "We've been looking into Annabelle's recent medical history, and it seems there's a pattern. It looks like she's had several procedures. Abortions. Without your knowledge." Leo's chest tightened as the words hit him like a physical blow. Are you telling me she's been aborting our children? Unfortunately, yes. Over the past few years, it seems she's terminated pregnancies without your consent or knowledge. There's more though. We also have evidence that Annabel has been involved in multiple affairs with other men. Her infidelity goes far beyond anything we've seen. I'm sorry, Mr. Leo, his lawyer continued, his voice somber, but you deserve to know the truth. I recommend you take action immediately. Leo couldn't speak. His mind was racing, his heart in turmoil. The woman he had trusted, the woman who had vowed to be his partner, had betrayed him in ways he could hardly comprehend. The pain was overwhelming. For so long, he had tried to make their marriage work, to keep it together for the sake of a dream that Annabel never shared. Now that dream felt shattered, and the truth was staring him in the face. Leo made up his mind then and there. It was time to end the marriage. He couldn't stay with someone who had lied to him, who had stripped him of the chance to be a father. He didn't tell Annabel that day. He couldn't bear to face her just yet. Instead, he spent the night alone, drowning in his thoughts, contemplating the path forward. It was the hardest decision he had ever made, but it felt necessary. Annabel had robbed him of the family he had longed for, and he couldn't continue living in the shadow of that betrayal. The next day, Leo called for a divorce lawyer, and the wheels began to turn. Annabel was going to find out soon enough, but it wasn't going to be easy. Their marriage had been built on lies, and now it was coming apart at the seams. Leo could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity. The fog that had clouded his vision for so long was lifting, and he knew what he needed to do. Meanwhile, Sophia had been grappling with her own struggles. Her family's reaction to her pregnancy had been nothing short of disastrous. Her mother, who had always been strict and demanding, was furious when she found out. She couldn't understand how her daughter, who had always been so responsible, could end up in such a mess. Sophia's father, though quieter, was no better. He demanded answers, berated her for the mistake, and made it clear that he didn't think much of the situation. Sophia had tried to explain that it wasn't her fault, but it felt like no one was listening. They saw her as irresponsible, a disappointment. She felt trapped, unable to explain how a mix-up at the hospital had led to this pregnancy. She leaned on Leo during this time, though she didn't want to burden him. Their connection had deepened, and their late-night conversations were the only thing keeping her sane. Leo, despite the storm of emotions he was facing with his own marriage, offered her comfort and understanding. One evening, when the tension with her family was at its peak, Sophia met with Leo again, desperate for some peace of mind. They sat in his office, a place that seemed both intimidating and comforting at the same time. "I don't know what to do, Leo," Sophia admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I feel like I'm losing everything." Leo looked at her with a quiet intensity, his eyes soft but full of understanding. "I know what it's like to feel lost. But I don't want you to go through this alone. I'm here for you. We're in this together." Sophia's heart swelled with emotion. She wasn't sure what the future held for them, but for the first time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something more. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward together. The divorce proceedings were quick, but the emotions behind them were anything but. Leo was numb as he sat in the sterile lawyer's office, signing the papers that would officially end his marriage to Annabel. He had spent years trying to make it work, hoping that one day she would change, that she would want what he wanted. But the reality of her betrayal, her constant disregard for their future, was impossible to ignore. The papers were signed, and Leo took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision lift from his shoulders. He knew he had done the right thing, but the pain of it still lingered. His life, his dreams, had been built on a false foundation. And now, as the finality of the divorce settled in, Leo felt both relieved and deeply, profoundly lost. After Leo's divorce was finalized, he wasted no time reaching out to Sophia. She had been a constant source of comfort for him, someone who had helped him see beyond his own pain and confusion. He needed her more than he had realized, and he wasn't about to let her slip away now. One evening, after weeks of quiet conversations and emotional confessions, Leo invited Sophia to dinner at a small restaurant in the city. It was a quiet, intimate place, one that didn't carry the usual noise and distractions of the world outside. They sat across from each other, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows on their faces as they spoke. "I've been thinking," Leo began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I can't keep living like this, hiding from what I want. I don't want to pretend anymore. I want to be a father. I want to build a family, a real family. With you." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. She had never expected to hear those words, not from someone like Leo. He had his own life, his own empire, and yet here he was, offering her a chance at something more than she ever thought possible. She had spent so many years feeling small, unsure of herself, but in that moment, Leo was offering her a future. I don't know what to say," Sophia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This isn't easy, Leo. But I've thought about this too, about what we can build together. I'm scared, but I know we're both in this together." Leo reached across the table, taking her hand in his. There was no hesitation in his touch, no second thoughts. He knew that this was the right path for him, for them. He had lost so much in his life, but Sophia had shown him that love and family weren't things to be taken for granted. They were things to fight for. "We'll figure it out, Sophia," Leo said softly. "We don't have to have it all figured out right now. We just have to take it one step at a time." The weight of the words hung in the air between them, but there was an undeniable sense of clarity in that moment. Neither of them knew what the future would hold, but together, they could face whatever came next. As they left the restaurant that night, hand in hand, the world felt different. The city around them was still buzzing with the noise of life, but for the first time, Leo and Sophia felt at peace. They were no longer victims of their circumstances. They were active participants in the life they were building together. Back at Sophia's home, her parents were still reeling from the news of her pregnancy. They didn't understand why she had chosen to keep the baby, why she had decided to continue down a path that seemed so uncertain. They had tried to convince her to terminate the pregnancy, to move on with her life. But Sophia refused. She couldn't let fear or judgment dictate her future. She had made her choice, and she would stand by it, no matter the consequences. The confrontation with her parents was heated. Her mother cried, begging her to think about her future. Her father was no less angry, but Sophia stood firm. "I know this isn't what you wanted for me, but this is my life, and I have to live it on my terms," she said, her voice shaking with emotion but full of conviction. "I'm going to be a mother, and I'm going to raise this child, with or without your support." It wasn't easy, but over time, Sophia's parents began to soften. It took time for them to accept the situation, but they saw how determined she was. They saw how much she loved Leo, how much she had grown through the difficult choices she had made. Months passed, and as Sophia's belly grew, so did the strength of their bond. Leo's company thrived as he focused more on the things that truly mattered. His family, his future. He kept his distance from the bitter remnants of his marriage, focusing instead on the life he was building with Sophia. And then, on a crisp autumn morning, Sophia gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Leo was there, holding her hand through every moment, every contraction, and when the baby finally arrived, he looked at her with awe and wonder. "She's ours," Sophia whispered, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Yes," Leo said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's ours." In that moment, Leo realized that all the pain, all the heartache had led him to this. He had a family now, a real one. And with Sophia by his side, he knew they would face whatever came next, together. Their story was just beginning. Did you enjoy this story? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to tell me where you're watching from. This week's special shout-out is to Janice Collins from Cleveland, Ohio.